In this video, our goal is to answer the question, what makes lines parallel or perpendicular? Many of us were struggling on this chapter, so we need to review what makes lines parallel or perpendicular. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what is parallel and what is perpendicular. So we're going to draw a little picture of parallel lines. Now, parallel lines, what we should know is that parallel lines are two lines that never cross. So here are two lines that I've drawn that are parallel. I could draw another pair of lines just to make sure you understand. Another pair of parallel lines, well, I could swing these around. These never cross. They go in opposite directions. The same direction, excuse me. They go in the exact same direction. They never touch each other. The two sides of the road are parallel in any road that you might draw. So that's what parallel lines are. They never cross. Now, what does it mean for algebra? Well, when we're talking about algebra, we're talking about rules. Y equals mx plus b. So we have two rules. What makes the two rules parallel lines? Lines are parallel when they have the same slope. Because remember, slope tells me how steep these lines are. And if they have the same steepness, then they have the same slope, and they will never touch each other. It's like two people saving $10 a month. They'll never catch up to each other if Susie starts before Jimmy. They have the same slope. And in our case, of course, we need to remember that slope is m. So they have the same m value. And that's something you should have discovered in your algebra class. So parallel is actually going to be fairly easy. We simply are going to use the same exact slope. Perpendicular is a little bit more work because perpendicular, number one, is different than parallel. Perpendicular means two lines that cross at a perfect corner. They make a perfect 90-degree angle. These are two perpendicular lines. If I were to draw a rectangle, these two lines, this line and this line, are perpendicular. They cross at a nice corner, a nice right angle. What happens with these guys is their slopes are going to be different. So here's my slope of my perpendicular one line. If I look at my slope of the other line, it's actually the exact same triangle, but turned. It's the exact same slope triangle, but turned. So what happens is perpendicular lines, you flip the slope and make it the opposite. Now that's a lot to remember, but I'll show you some examples so that you can make sense of that. You flip the slope and make it the opposite. So those are the two key words, flipping and opposite. So here's an example. If my slope was 2/5, I would flip it, and it would become 5/2. So by flipping, you're switching the numbers around. And become the opposite. Opposite means it becomes negative. So if 2/5 is positive, we flip it, and we make it opposite. 5/2, negative. Let's look at just a couple more examples. Another example would be 4/3, negative. I'm going to flip it, so now it's going to become 3/4, and instead of making it negative, it's going to be a positive slope. So there's two things that go on here. You flip the fraction, and you flip the sign. Two things are going to change. One last example, this is one that often throws students off. If I have a slope of 2, I need to flip it and make it the opposite. So notice that it starts positive, so of course we know it's going to be negative, but how do I flip 2? There's only one number. So here's what you have to remember is that 2 can be written as 2/1. That's the slope I would use, up 2/1. I flip it and it becomes -1/2. These two lines would be perpendicular. Now these are all about slope. So what's most important is that parallel perpendicular lines are all about slope. So now let's take a look at some example practice problems, just so we can get the hang of this before you give it a shot on your own. So let's take a look at this first example. Which lines are parallel? Now, all we have to remember is we see that keyword parallel and we ask ourselves, what does that mean? Well, parallel means they never cross, and it actually means they have the same slope. Now I look at my lines, and I'm looking for lines that have the same slope. Line A, the slope is 2. I have to know that 2 is my slope, and -4, this -4 is my y-intercept. So it actually has nothing to do with the problem because I am simply looking for lines with the same slope. B has a slope of -3. That's different than A. C has a slope of -3 as well. Slope is always with the x. So right now I have one answer. B and C are parallel because they have the same slope. Let's keep checking. D, what's the slope of D? Do you notice that it's missing? If it's missing, remember we use the number 0. So the slope for D is 0. So that's not parallel to either of my numbers. Last but not least, this final slope of 2x, 2 is my slope, is parallel to A. So A and E are parallel. Oops, I spelled that wrong. Parallel. So B and C were parallel, and A and E were parallel. And again, it's all because of these slopes. This 2 was the same as this 2, 2x and 2x. The next one was -3 and -3. They were the same slope, therefore they are parallel. Now let's take a look at perpendicular. Similar example, but now which lines are perpendicular? So what I have to remember is that the slopes, when I see the word perpendicular, I remember that the slopes flip to the opposite. They flip 2 ways. So let's look at A and let's find the perpendicular slope. There's the slope of A. A line perpendicular would flip the 2, and remember that means 2 is really 2 over 1. I flip it and it becomes 1 over 2. Now I would flip it to the opposite. So since it was -2, it's going to be +1/2. So 1/2 is a slope that is perpendicular to the slope of -2. So let's see, do I see any slopes of 1/2? Yes, I do. A and C are perpendicular because the slope here is 1/2, which is the flip and opposite of A, which is -2. Again, 1/2, flip it, would become 2, and make it its opposite, it would become -2, which is the slope up here. So that's why those 2 lines are perpendicular. It looks like E has a slope of -2, so it also is perpendicular to C because it's the flip and the opposite. So I have 2 sentences I can write. A and C are perpendicular. And also C and E are perpendicular. Notice that E is parallel to A. They have the same slope. They are parallel lines. Let's take a look at B and try and find its perpendicular slope and see if it's maybe perpendicular to D. B, 2, we flip it, so it becomes 1/2. Remember, we put it over 1. And now we make it its opposite, so it's going to become negative. Yes, it is perpendicular to D. So my final statement is B and D are perpendicular. So it is something to memorize. You have to memorize what makes them perpendicular and then memorize how to do it. So parallel will definitely be easier, so let's make sure we master parallel today, and then we'll keep practicing perpendicular if we need to. So let's look at 2 more examples where we actually are finding lines using a fact about parallel and perpendicular. So example 3, now we're writing a rule, so we pull out the important information, we're writing a rule, So we start to think, what does that mean in math? That means I'm going to write a rule for a line that looks like this, because a line always has that rule. It has to go through the point 3, 1, and it's parallel to the line y equals negative 2x minus 4. Let's first look at the parallel idea. Remember parallel, we remember what we've just learned, that parallel have the same slope. So now I look at this line and I simply look at the slope. I want it to be parallel to that line, so it has to have the same slope as that line. Well, the slope of this line is negative 2, because slope is always the number of x's. So my slope is negative 2. That means my line is going to have a slope equal to negative 2. That's all I can conclude from the parallel portion. This negative 4 doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything because it has nothing to do with my line. The parallel idea, all I pulled out was the slope. The slope was the important part here, the negative 2. So notice I have half of my rule written. Because the other thing I memorized is that m is always the slope, so negative 2 goes in for m. I have half my rule written. Now let's take a look at that last piece of information. Remember the 3, 1? That we knew this point 3, 1? Well, now we simply plug in the point 3, 1. 3 for x, 1 for y. And we solve for b. So this is now hitting on what many of you have gotten pretty good at in finding your b value. So I'm plugging in the point to find my intercept. 1 equals negative 6 plus b. Adding 6 to both sides, I get 7 equals b. So my rule is y equals, I use what I started here, negative 2x plus 7. This is my rule for this question because of two things. It is parallel to this rule because it has the same slope, and it goes through the point 3, 1, and I could check that, but I just found b using that. If I plug in 3, I should get 1. So this is a rule that meets these requirements. Now let's try one with perpendicular. So if you memorize what parallel means, this is no different than many of the questions you've learned. Perpendicular, of course, is a little more to memorize, but we're going to do this one together, and then you'll try some on your own. Write a rule for a line that goes through the point 6, negative 2, and is perpendicular to this line. So first of all, a rule for a line. That tells me that I'm writing a rule that looks like this, y equals mx plus b. So I have to find m and b. Then I remember, perpendicular means something about the slopes. So I pull out the slope of this line, and the slope of this line is negative 1/4, because it's always the number of x's. Remember, the negative 4 doesn't mean anything. It does not affect my line. I simply pull out the slope. Now I need to make the line perpendicular, because that's what it's asking. So to make it perpendicular, I switch the slope by flipping it and turning it to its opposite. So since it was negative, I'm going to make it positive. So my slope is positive 4. Once I simplify that, 4 divided by 1 is just 4. So that's good. Now I have half my rule because slope is always my m value. So I put it in for m right here, and I get y equals 4x plus b. So I have half my rule written. Now I use what I know about finding b, which is I'm going to plug in this point 6, negative 2. So I'm plugging in the point 6, negative 2 here into my numbers x and y. And I'm going to solve for b. Because my point 6, negative 2 has to work in this rule. Now I'm solving by simplifying, so I get 24 plus b. Subtract 24 from both sides. I get negative 26 equals b. So now I'm ready to write my rule. The rule I started with my slope of 4, was y equals 4x. And now I know b is negative 26, so I write minus 26 for b. This is my rule for this line. It is perpendicular to the line they gave me, and it goes through the point 6, negative 2. So some of you will find that this is difficult, not pretending that it isn't difficult, but you have to practice it to become good at it and ask lots of questions. Parallel should fit with a lot of what you've already learned. Perpendicular is the tough one, so keep at it, keep asking questions. But finish the worksheet and ask lots of questions until you get the hang of it.